History teaches us that Russian military strength is a myth. Many people have been shocked by just how bad the Russian military have been doing in their invasion of the Ukraine. But really, no one should be, least of all students of history, as the record is clear here. Russia is not particularly good at war. In fact, the Russians are usually terrible. However, thanks to propaganda, memes, and bad history, there is still a myth that the Russians are hard asses and make good soldiers. Like most myths, this is a lot of dross with a few chunks of truth in it. So, let's look at cases, starting with the most recent. The last real war the Russians had, before this one, was the Chechen War. Yes, I'm skipping over Crimea 2014 and Georgia 2008, because those were, more correctly, maneuvers with petty skirmishes, than actual wars. For example, in the so-called Georgian War, only 180 Georgians died, so it doesn't really count as a proper war. Ukraine 2014 was something similar. In fact, it looks like in both cases they were conned by the Russian myth of military invincibility, whereas the Chechens back in the 90s weren't. The Chechen War lasted from 1994 to 2009, with a few ceasefires along the way. Yes, that's 15 years. Because obviously, we're talking about two enormous titans here, Russia versus a dot that most people can't even find on a map, with a population just over 1 million. Technically Russia won the war, but it was more like a defeat. This is clear if you look at how much the Russians bribed the Chechens to be their friends today. Going further back, next on our list is the Afghan War. Russia lost, obviously, but a lot of Putin fans try to minimize this defeat by claiming that the British in the 19th century, and NATO in the 21st century, also lost. Actually, this is not true. Sure, the British had a setback now and then in Afghanistan, but basically they beat the Afghans who agreed to Britain running their foreign policy for them for around 50 years from the end of the Second Afghan War. Following the NATO invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the NATO forces pretty much defeated the Taliban, who ended up hiding in caves, unlike the Mujahideen, who kept going toe-to-toe with the Soviets back in the 1980s. The Taliban only found a way back in Afghanistan because the Western forces wanted an exit strategy, which was to train up the locals to keep the lid on the defeated Taliban. It was this training exercise that failed, not the actual war. The Taliban essentially defeated other Afghans, not NATO. Western losses in the last few years were minuscule. Compare this with the Soviet-Afghan War to see what I mean. So, yes, the Russians lost in Afghanistan, but the British and NATO didn't, although the NATO attempt at nation-building failed. Next, going back further, I'll skip over the Soviet clashes with China in the 1960s, as these were relatively minor with little real fighting. In the 1950s, the Russians didn't do much either, besides invading their allies, Hungary 1956, etc., so no points for that. This takes us to World War II, the so-called Great Soviet Victory. This definitely does not reflect well on the Russians. Russian losses were tremendous, and it was only the vast spaces of Russia, the bad roads, the terrible weather, and the lack of gasoline that stopped the Germans winning. That, as well as the Western Allies. People will claim that the Red Army killed more Germans than the Western Allies. But the facts are that victory was more the result of Western manpower, weapons, and material. In all, a grand total of 14,095,153 German troops were killed or captured in the war. Of that, 8,352,244, or nearly 60%, were killed or captured by the Western Allies. As for the Soviets, they lost 14 million servicemen killed in action, although a large number of these were probably killed by their own side. You also may not know that more Red Army troops perished in the glorious Soviet victory of Stalingrad than Germans. Without the Western Allies, it is clear that the Germans would have made mincemeat of the Russians. The war before that, Russia's Winter War of 1940-1941, with Finland, was also a disaster. Many of you are familiar with how poorly the Russians fought in that one, so there is no need to go into detail. This takes us back to the Russian Civil War, in which the Russians again fought badly, this time mainly against themselves. The Reds only won because everyone else lost interest, except for the Poles who beat them. The war before that was, of course, World War I. While the Russians did well against the Austro-Hungarians, they were totally outclassed by what was the German army's B team. Their A team was, of course, getting slowly defeated by the British and the French on the Western Front. Then, the war before this was the Russo-Japanese War. Yes, Russia defeated by yet another tiny minnow, as Japan was much smaller, relatively backward, and was doing all the attacking, while the lazy Tsarist army was just defending. Defending is almost always easier than attacking. The only real attack the Russians launched in that war was with their navy, and look at what happened to that. I could go on, back into the 19th century, but the pattern would be more or less the same: poor Russian performances, with occasional victories, eked out through big numbers, a technological edge over primitives, or through having great allies. Really, a country with this kind of track record should be a lot more careful about getting involved in pointless wars.